Today we're going to talk about the P200, and this will be a full product walk around from the physical features of the camera all the way to the web UI and how to use it. And so if you're new to the camera or you'd like to learn how to use it better, or there are things on the web UI that you have questions about, hopefully this video will do a pretty good job of explaining all of those things to you so that you have a good grasp on how to set it up and get it working. Now, first thing out of the gates is that we need to remember something fundamental about cameras. The first thing is that these cameras are entry-level broadcast cameras. They're Sony lenses that are used in the broadcast world. And so the number one thing, the first and foremost thing that you need to remember is lighting. Light is king when it comes to capturing accurate colors and data on a camera lens like a BirdDog P200. P200 really works well in a well-lit studio or in a well-lit room, a well-lit conference room, or things where you're going to have ample light, more than you think you need. That is usually where the P200 shines. And the reason for this is because the lenses are quite big and the sensor is quite big, and so that requires a lot of light and a lot of data to make those colors look accurate. But the benefit of having accurate lighting is that you get a very rich shot, you get a very rich picture, and the P200 is a perfect entry level into making your footage look semi-professional or professional if you play the game and properly light the set. And so we're very interested in providing you that data. If you're struggling with the P200 looking accurate, or perhaps they're doing wild things on full auto, I'll explain why that is. I'll explain kind of where that comes to, and how to correct it, and why we say that we need ample lighting. But lighting is king in this instance because you have to have enough light in order for the subject to be seen clearly without introducing things like artificial gain. And again, I'll talk about what happens when we do that. Now, first thing I want to do is take a legit walk around this camera. P200 has some great features that we should note right away, and this is the classic BirdDog look for a long time. It has looked something like this or similar to this for quite a while, and so when we connect to the P200, first thing we're going to notice is that this is a black colored model, but there is a white color model as well that is available right now. And I think that those ones are also still on sale, but its successor is the P240. And so that's kind of the next step up in the 200 series. But the 200 has some very distinct features and things that we want to kind of touch on. So the form factor is very standard for BirdDog, and there is no little LCD screen on the front like you would notice on the 110, 120. So this, again, is a first-gen product. We moved that into the second-gen products. But we have a dominant front-facing tally light. Many people mistake this for a button. It is not a button. It is a tally light, and it is not to be pushed. And what happens there is when you select that camera inside the preview window, that light will turn green, which you can see there. Now, if I select off of that camera, that tally light turns off. And if I select it again, it will turn on green, which was not always the case in the first generation of this product. It was actually just red or off. But now we've programmed it with a green light as well. And so when you use a program like vMix or Wirecast or TriCaster, and you load this in the preview window, that light will turn green. Now, there is no way to trigger this otherwise. It's NDI metadata, and that information comes from video switchers that speak NDI natively. And so, again, vMix, Wirecast, and TriCaster are the main uses for that. There are also other programs like OBS and a few others that I don't know if they send tally information. I'm not sure, but I know those three for sure do. And those are, if you're serious about streaming with NDI, those are the primary three for software that you're probably going to be looking at anyway. So again, vMix and TriCaster and Wirecast are great products that all speak NDI metadata. And when we load this camera into the preview window, that tally light turns green. And then when we turn it and put it in the program window, which I can't do because that would then show the feed from the camera itself, that light turns red. And I know that that works because I've got another camera inside of that I'm looking at right now to give this presentation, and that light is currently red. So that light turns green and red, and that's your onboard tally. It's great. The sides here have these kind of heat dispersion fins. That's what those are. They are not to be manipulated, not to be painted, and not to be changed, because that is how this camera, which is fanless, dissipates heat. And so be sure that you keep those free and clear. You don't encase them in anything. They are designed for ambient air to remove heat away from the body of the camera. The camera itself will get quite warm, but it's designed to do that. It's designed to handle heat and to use the ambient air to take care of that for you. And so please don't paint those. Please don't alter those. That's super important. The camera has the ability to spin at a home position, basically from 180, basically for 360 degrees, but it does stop, and then that's its limit that it can go. And so if we were to spin this thing around, let me do that for you on camera. So we go from one extreme to another. We're able to spin this camera around, and that's as far as it will go one way. And then if you need to spin it around and go the other way, you do need, it doesn't go all the way through 360 consistently. It does have a stopper at an extreme, because there are wires and cables that go down through the body of the camera that are going to get tangled if you do that. So the camera itself has the ability to basically go all the way around. However, it does not continuously go all the way around like an A200 or A300. The other thing on this camera that we should talk about briefly is there is a little network data transmission light. And you'll notice here on the front that you'll see a little green light that flashes yellow every now and then. That has to do with, is the signal being brought into a video switcher or into Studio Monitor, and are commands being given. So if I steer the camera, for example, you'll see that yellow light flashes a lot more. And that's because it's receiving data across the wire and is interpreting that, and so it's showing that function. And to date, I don't believe that you can turn that off. However, it's a very small little diode that's inside the camera and is pretty unnoticeable for the most part. And so I know of customers that have put gaff tape, black gaff tape, over it to eliminate it altogether. That is your choice. That should not change the performance of the camera, but of course, we don't recommend altering the camera in any way if possible. Okay, the other piece then that we need to talk about is the back of the camera, because this is where we're going to make all of our connections, and we're going to utilize this for the functionality of the camera itself. And so I will move this over a little bit so you can see that clearer. The Ethernet cable is plugged into the IP/NDI port, and that port is used to transmit PoE plus power and network data to the camera. And so you will notice that I am able to control this camera. I'm able to use this camera. I can bring in the NDI streams all over one cable. And that is the point of most of our products, is that it is supposed to be a one cable install where you receive the video, you receive the control and the tally commands, all of that over one connection. And you're able to power the camera as well with a proper PoE plus switch. Now, this becomes a bit of a question. I should take a second to really talk about this, because there does tend to be some conversation around PoE plus with a P200. You need to use a PoE plus switch, layer 2 or layer 3, please, not smart managed, not unmanaged. You need to use a switch that you are able to turn off power conservation modes so that they do not throttle the PoE usage for the camera. What's going to happen is, if it has power conservation, the switch itself is going to watch the power usage over a short period of time and determine what the average power drawdown is. Typically, if a PoE device on a network draws wattage of various degrees, that's usually an indicator that the product isn't working correctly. However, in our instance, we have several stepping motors and, a bunch of other functions that draw power at various times, especially when you move the camera head. So we need to turn off power conservation on the port so that the port will deliver up to PoE plus at all times. Now, to pull the curtain back a little bit more, the average draw for this camera on just idle, okay, when it's sitting and not doing anything and just powered up, is about 14 watts, give or take, okay, a little bit. When it's moving, it's closer to 18 or 19 watts. And so if you understand networking and power, it passes the PoE threshold to PoE plus. PoE is 15.4 watts, whereas PoE plus can be up to 30. And so if your smart switch, or if your power conservation enabled switch watches the camera while the camera is idle and determines this device needs 14 watts, and then when you go to move the camera, it will reboot the camera because there's not enough power, and it will short out. It'll basically brown out and go into the boot up sequence. So if you're finding anytime you want to move the camera, it starts rebooting, it's probably a PoE power issue on the switch level. And so that's a fun little thing that we found out early on in the days, that it draws 14 watts on average, which is PoE. But then when you move it, it draws 17, 18, 19 watts, which is PoE plus. So be sure that your switch is able to deliver PoE plus constantly without any sort of throttling. And so you need to go in and turn off any power conservation, EEE standards, anything like that on those ports. And the best case scenario here is to use an AV line switch like the Netgear line of AV switches, which will be set up to do this kind of natively. Okay, so PoE plus is required if you're going to do a one cable connection, which will take about 19 watts on your switch. Now, one little sidebar about that is be careful not to buy a switch with a budget, with a PoE budget, and think, okay, I need 19 watts per camera. That means I can divide, 150 watts by 19, if that's what your power budget is. I can divide it by 19 watts, and that will tell me how many cameras I can do. You're also going to want to consider giving about 20% overhead in power. Just because the nature is, I'm saying average 17, 18, 19. I'm not saying it is only. And so be sure that you give about a 20% breathing room on your PoE budget when you're considering things like that. So 19 watts plus 20%, and then, which is what, another almost 4 watts. So let's call it 24 to be fair, 24 to be even. Let's say 24 watts per camera, and then you can divide that into your budget, and that should be appropriate for considering power budgeting. Okay, also on the back of here, then, we're going to kind of go from one side to the other. We have 2 other Ethernet ports. These are RS-232 and RS-422 control, serial VISCA control commands. Okay, so you can plug in an Ethernet cable. It will need to be custom fit for that Ethernet jack. And then you're going to need to look at your controller and figure out which pins need to be which. It also comes with a Phoenix breakout connector. So the camera itself comes with a Phoenix breakout connector for 232 and 422, which allows you to make your own custom cables for control. I'm going to shoot straight with you here. Our intention with this camera is so that you can use those options, but we are focused on NDI control. We want that to be the first and foremost one cable connection. Our goal is to make this as simple to install and versatile as possible, thinking that you're going to capitalize on NDI video, NDI control, NDI metadata for tally, and all those items, and then PoE over the same cable. Okay, so if you use NDI control, you can just run one Ethernet cable, Cat5e or Cat6 of some category. Please do not do Cat7 or anything else right now. Cat5e, Cat6, and so on. These cameras are designed for a one cable install, and that is exactly what we're seeing here. Okay, I have control, I have metadata, I have video, I have everything coming into my vMix studio over one cable. And so it's incredibly convenient. So those 2 Ethernet ports on the bottom that are not being used are for a different command protocol known as VISCA. Okay, now don't be confused. There's VISCA IP, there's VISCA, and then there are subcategories. So there's 232 and 422. There are other protocols that fall into that VISCA protocol. And then there are multiple protocols of VISCA IP, like Sony and Panasonic, and so on. And so we use Sony VISCA IP as one of our command options, but we're really focused on NDI. That's where we think the convenience of buying a BirdDog camera really shines, is having a one cable connection. Now, above those ports, you're going to see a USB port, a standard USB-A port. That port is for doing firmware updates, which everybody who's been around BirdDog is well aware of, doing those firmware updates over USB. We're working really hard to limit the need for that port. It's not completely gone, but we're working really hard to make it simple and maybe even more of a one-click update option, but more on that as time progresses. Now, there's a dial next to that USB port that's a little rotary dial. When you use this camera without the NDI function, you can set the resolution with that rotary dial. However, if you are using any of the BirdDog functions, you need to leave that rotary dial in default. And the reason why we do that is because you can also change all of the options for this camera and its baseboard on the BirdDog web UI for the camera. I'm going to show you all that right here on the show. But you can manipulate all of those, including the resolution, but we expect you to make those changes in the web UI and not physically on the camera. And so, for example, there are matrix switches on the bottom of this camera, which I can show you in a minute. Those matrix switches need to be in default. The rotary dial needs to be in default. Leave those in default unless you're not using this BirdDog camera for the BirdDog features that we've created, okay? So if you're just SDI out and you're doing 232, you can change the resolution there, but your results may vary. Our focus is making it all NDI compatible, doing everything on the web UI for alterations. Okay, so that rotary dial is for the most part needs to just be left in default. The next, there's like a little switch that's right next to that. It says 1, 2, 3. This is for the IR remote. I don't actually have the P200 remote here, but it comes with a little gray remote. And that allows you to control up to 3 cameras. And this would be how you identify those cameras with that IR remote. So camera 1 on the remote would need to be switched to position 1 right there next to the rotary dial. So you change that to 1. And then if you want to use the same remote for camera 2, you would change that switch to 2 on the camera that you want it to be camera 2. And then on the remote, you press 2, and it will then control that one as well. So you can do up to 3 with the little gray remote should you want to do that. Okay, next to that is the audio in and out. Now, this is a interesting little feature because there are varying philosophies about whether or not you should use it. Some guys like to use this port to put their microphone directly into the camera and then bring audio and video over to their vMix production. There is a philosophy though out there which is prominent. Okay, a lot of people feel this way, not just me, that you should bring your video and your audio and your other elements together independently. Meaning that you don't merge them until you absolutely have to. And ideally, you'd be bringing those into something like a video switcher. So using vMix or Wirecast or TriCaster, you would bring them in there natively as best you can. Now, my microphone is the beautiful EVR-E20, and this broadcast standard microphone comes across over XLR to a Behringer interface for my computer. And then it goes into my computer, and I bring that in as a native audio source, and I line up the video and the audio so that there's no delay. That gives me the maximum flexibility, and I actually am not compromising the signal that's being created at all. It's going basically directly through, and I'm only merging it at the very end when I'm sending it out to the stream. Now, this may not be your situation, and you may be required to have an audience mic, or maybe you only have a TRS connection that you have to put in to the camera for audio, and that's okay. It does allow you to do that. However, it would be you will be merging it, and it will be encoding it and adding it to the NDI signal and sending that across. And again, the philosophy usually is don't change the signal any more than you have to. And although we're not really manipulating the audio or degrading it at all, we are changing it. And so that goes against that rule of changing the true sound of the microphone or the audio before you genuinely have to. And so you usually think of it as video, audio, presentation, lighting, and you put them in those silos and you bring them together at the final point. So there is an audio in. It's a TRS port. It's a 3.5 millimeter jack. Do not use TRRS because that is a microphone and now let me think that through here. Yes, it's a TRS. It's left-right on the camera. So on the back of the camera, there is an audio in, and then there is an audio out, which will allow you to use this in instances where maybe you want to use BirdDog comms or something like that. So if you wanted, for some reason, to have a microphone in the audio in and then a headset on the audio out, you could do that. I don't know of a ton of people that do that because I don't know people who are manning PTZs. I don't know why you would need a headset at them, but I have been surprised in the past, and I'm willing to be surprised again in the future. So there is an audio jack on here that you can use. Now, there are also a couple other video out options. So you have an HDMI, you have a composite, and you have an SDI, a 3G SDI. And so that's what that triangle is there. You have HDMI. Okay, you have the just straight up composite out, and then you've got an SDI output at 3G, which many people run SDI and then they use NDI as the alternate, and that has been done for an age. The SDI and the HDMI and the NDI and the composite all work together at the same time. So you don't have to pick and choose. You don't have to turn one off to turn on another. They all output video at the same time. And so if you want redundancy and you want to use NDI but you want to bring back an SDI line or vice versa, that is an option with the P200. Okay, that kind of takes us for the full circuit around the camera. And now I want to spend a little bit of time over on the web UI to kind of illustrate all of the things that we have going on. And so you're going to land on the web UI page, and this is where you're going to make your alterations as you need to. Now, this web page works really well. I'm going to open up Studio Monitor here, and let me just get this added as well. Put this maybe here, put this here, and I don't need to be that big. Okay, so this web UI is great because it gives you all the data of everything that's happening inside the camera at a moment's notice. Now, at the top, you're going to notice we have our CPU usage and our network bandwidth. Those are critical items to pay attention to. When you are connected to the camera stream, so if vMix is watching it or you got it open in Studio Monitor or something like that, you're going to see the network bandwidth open up. We have a 1 gig port, and truly, it's like all 1 gig ports. It's going to function great anywhere under 700 megs, okay? It's not going to be able to function at 1 gig indefinitely forever. And so if you're connecting multiple studio monitors over TCP with this camera, it's going to load up that bandwidth pretty fast. But if you're running a multicast or something like that, you won't really have to worry about that. Now, the CPU usage is indicating how hard the actual NDI chip is functioning to get the image that you have set up out the actual NIC, and also then the network bandwidth, how much is actually using to do that. And we do have a few other little helpful things here that'll kind of tell us what is going on. The average bit rate is 110 megabits per second, which is a direct reflection of that network bandwidth. Now, you might notice that it's like, John, that doesn't really look like it's actively updating very fast. It's not. It's a web UI. It's actually taking snapshots. I think it's every second, and then reiterating that back to the web UI and back to the data so that we have that information available. And then the web UI is just reflecting those changes as it's been given it. So it's not an actual speedometer that you'd have on your car or something like that. This is just a reflection of data coming back to the camera and the chip reporting it as it arrives. Okay, so this is more like average. We're in the 30s, 30 CPU range, and probably somewhere in a quarter of the network capacity here. Now, I am connected to this camera multiple times, and so you're going to see that I've got a 1 gig port, but I'm using about 300 megs. So with Studio Monitor open and with it coming into vMix, that adds up. Right here in the middle, it tells us our device mode, which is we're in encode mode. There's no other mode to be in, by the way, but we are in encode mode, and it is confirmed streaming NDI. So by all accounts, this camera thinks I am currently and correctly streaming NDI onto the network. The video stream name, I'll explain this in a second, is Cam, and I'm running at 1080p 30. The audio status is analog, which means that I could plug in a 3.5 jack into the back of the camera, and it should encode the audio. Video resolution 1080p or 1920 by 1080p at 30 frames, and we're running at a sample rate of 422. This is super helpful to confirm that any resolution changes that you've made are being reflected back to the web UI. So you come back to the dashboard to verify that your changes have been made in that regard. There are 2 audio channels and always have been. The audio sample rate is 4800 or 48,000, which is the BirdDog standard right now. That is what we operate with, and we don't have any other options for that. Then there is Genlock status is not active. I'm not looking at another. This is NDI Genlock, okay, and doesn't have a Genlock port on it. The network mode is currently TCP, and I am not running a Silicon 2 protocol. This is running firmware 112, which is the latest on the website, which enables Silicon 2 on your camera. We'll talk about that in a second. The name of my camera, that how it identifies itself with the MDNS is BirdDog-Studio-P200, and then .local is where you get to the web UI. My MICU version is 24, and everything appears to be active. If this says inactive or is switching between active and inactive, you know that there is a problem. Probably a baseboard needs to be updated. Here is the IP address. This IP address, interesting fun fact, is actually issued by my DHCP reservation list. And this camera is running in DHCP mode, but I have told my DHCP to always issue 77.77 to the P200. That's my primary camera, and so I make it fairly easy to know. This is the current MAC address for this device, only MAC address for this device. And the bandwidth speed is reporting back at 10/100 1000. If this, for some reason, says 10/100, there's either an issue with your network port, your Ethernet cable, or something potentially wrong with the baseboard on the camera itself. Okay, this does tell me which camera I have. It's P200 A2A3, and so that is the firmware that I want to use. Anytime you click anywhere on the dashboard and you're not logged in, it's going to take you to the login page, which looks like this. And now we're going to talk about the network page. So on the network page, we have the option to go from DHCP to static. We've talked ad nauseum about why you should not select these buttons or change them. DHCP is the way to go. It is the simplest way to get up and running, and it can be managed just as easy as static without needing to touch every single device. And so there you go, I set it. But if I do set it to static, I could change it to static and then change these values. Strongly recommend that you design your static network, if you must, with a discovery server and a single subnet, a 22255 subnet mask. That is very critical. And also, a default gateway is required. Okay, so don't deviate from that. I'm telling you now, it's required. If you don't do it, that's not going to be too much fun for you. We can change the DHCP timeout, and what that actually is how long the camera waits broadcasting requests for the DHCP to respond. So in this case, the default is 20, but we can double that time, triple that time, whatever we want to do. Be careful with it, though, because the camera will not boot until that timeout request has timed out or been fulfilled. And so if you have an older DHCP, it may take a real long while to boot up. So start at 20, move it to 40 if that's ever needed, if your network is older and it can't accept those broadcast requests too much. The default fallback address, and I'm not too sure why we even include the subnet mask here, needs to remain 100/100 unless there is a security risk with that number for you. The reason why is because BirdDog support is geared to function and look for malfunctioning cameras at 192.168.100/100. And if you change that, that needs to be documented. If you do that and then don't know what it is, it's going to be very difficult without the camera coming into the office for us to be able to diagnose that. So be sure that you don't change that, especially if you're functioning in a static world. Don't change the fallback address. Just in general, don't change it. And you remember my MDNS name? Well, this is where I changed it. It used to be BirdDog Dash in the last 5 of the MAC address. Here is where I changed it to identify itself on the network as BirdDog-Studio-P200. And what you'll notice here in Studio Monitor, that is what it's called. So in Studio Monitor, the name shows up there as BirdDog-Studio-P200. And then the actual stream name is Cam. Okay, so you can change the name there. And then the short name, by the way, then ends up being BirdDog-Studio. Whoops, I put a period in there. BirdDog-Studio-P200.local. And then /. And if you click on that, it should take you to the web UI. Now, I've got multiple NIC cards connected here, and so that's probably what the delay is. But anyways, it should take you there right away if your MDNS is working correctly. Here is where we're going to change our NDI network settings. And if we want to go off of unicast, which is TCP, and change it to multicast, this is that last step that you would do that in, okay? So, and by the way, that is still loading. Okay, so you would change it from TCP, which is in unicast, to multicast. Now, people say, what about RUDP or UDP or anything like that? Those protocols are fine to use. However, you will probably find, consistency-wise, if you're in a unicast environment, to be running in TCP. And if you're getting so big, your NDI network is growing so fast, you really need to buy a switch that's able to do multicast. And I cannot recommend enough the AV line of switches from Netgear, 42 or 4350s. They will have multicast enabled on the profile already, and all you will need to do is change the transmit method here to multicast and hit apply. Discovery Server is a program that you're going to need if you're going to do a static network. And so if you are running static, you will need to have a Discovery Server, flat out. And Discovery Server is a little Windows executable program that runs in the background of your computer. It's not a sys-tray product, but it is just a little MS-DOS program, basically. And it will take in the information from your NDI sources and destinations and keep a master list. In static networks, we don't have a master list because usually the MDNS is not gathering adequate or at all broadcast packets that are identifying devices on the network. And so Discovery Server will replace that and create a much more stable, resilient network in static configurations. I've always said static on NDI is possible, but it's way more work. And so if you can avoid it, you don't necessarily need a Discovery Server if you're running DHCP, but you absolutely do if you're running it in static. All right, and then the Access Configuration Manager is a place where you can put remote IP addresses so that this camera can see remote sources in other subnets, not VLANs, subnets, okay? There's a big difference there. If you don't know the difference, please use the power of YouTube to find that out. So you can upload a list of IP addresses that are on different subnets, not VLANs, subnets, and it's so easy to do this now. We've made it super convenient. Shout out to the engineers for this. You click on Save, and it downloads a configuration file. When you open that configuration file, it will quite literally, cancel that. It will literally open a text file that looks like this. And see how this is very programmer language. It has the IP addresses right here, right? So 192.168.77, 23, and 192.168.77.45. Why not? Okay, so if we do this, no spaces, notice there are no spaces, and we go ahead and we say save, we're going to close this, and now I'm going to choose my file. Now notice these numbers here are from the previous file that I just downloaded. So now if I upload this, I'm going to say open, I'm going to say upload. If I do it correctly, this should dump me right back here. If I do it correctly, those IP addresses will appear here on the list in numerical order, okay? Now in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that numerical order, not IP list in numerical order. So if you upload it correctly, you will see it reflected here on the web UI. And if you do it wrong, just reconfigure that text file and try again. Super easy. Just follow the exact formatting that's provided from the example that downloads from the web UI. Same thing here. If you want to add NDI receive groups, okay, so if you're operating in a single flat subnet, but you want to separate things kind of in like soft boxes, you can do that with groups. And I have a video on NDI groups on our channel, so please check that out. But we can use groups, same rule applies. So we have downloaded the groups text file, and here it is. So the naming convention here, again, no spaces, but we want to say like BirdDog, 2901. I believe that was my studio name. And all you do is put this in quotations. Don't put any spaces. Hit save. We're going to then close this down. We're going to choose the file. That's this one right here. Say open. And if I do it correctly, say upload. If I do it correctly, oh, did I download it and then I didn't do it correctly? Okay, here we go. Let's try that again. Upload. That name should appear on this list as well. There it is, BirdDog 2901. So it's not difficult. The powers of your deductive reasoning will be able to sort that out. But that's how you do it, and it's pretty simple. There you go. Then if we need to add, by the way, talking about groups, if we need to add this camera to a group, we can fill in the name, whatever the group is, okay, and hit enable. And then it will only broadcast to people that are in that group. And so BirdDog is kind of the default. Now, in a future update, I've been told that this is changing to all boxes like this where you can fill them in and remove them on the web UI. So it'll be much simpler. But as of today, that's how you do it, and it's really not that difficult. Okay, and then you would hit enable, and that would add it then to that send group. Okay, next tab. Here is where we change that password. Remember that first password I put in on the web UI to get in after the dashboard? That's where you change it. So you put in the current password, and then you would put in your new password, okay? So new password, confirm the new password, hit apply. Please document your changes because it's very difficult to help you out if you don't know what the password is on your device. Now, BirdDog support can help you. Okay, we do have a method of doing that, but it's way more convenient if you remember your password. So please remember your password. System update, this is where we're going to load a .fw firmware update file. So if BirdDog Engineering comes out with a new update for the camera, we load the .fw file here and hit upload. And then it will take you to a little screen and show you the progress and tell you when it's done. We can also do a system reboot here, which is basically a restart of the baseboard. Okay, so the baseboard does a soft cycle or a power cycle, like a soft power cycle. Doesn't actually turn off and on, but it does a soft power cycle and will reboot the board, the baseboard, and then the NDI chip. There's also a fun little added thing here that I think our Commander-in-Chief, Dan, got implemented, which is a light mode and a dark mode of the web UI. I personally like the dark mode. I usually wear all black anyways, and so I like this look, but people were complaining that it was really hard to see in the sunlight outside on crappy computer screens. So we made a light mode, and that has been received quite well. So that's where you change that there, and it will just stay as is. Now, the next tab is AV setup, and this is where we get into customizing the camera and how it looks. So if you're wondering about, okay, I bought this camera, it just doesn't look right, but I know I have ample light. Remember what I said at the beginning, have adequate lighting for your subject. All right, now we're going to get into setting up the camera to use it for a production. First things first, there is a way to change the audio on the device between a loop out or comms. So if you wanted to add this as a comms channel on your BirdDog comms, you would select that here. These are digital gains, okay? They are not preamps. They are digital gains. So they're increasing the volume digitally of the signal, and they're not preamps on board the camera. As a general rule, with audio being added to the camera, it needs to be in its final form when it gets to the camera, because the BirdDog is not going to really do anything to enhance the audio. It's going to encode it into ones and zeros and send it across the network. So don't rely on BirdDog as your preamp. Be sure that it has already had an adequate line level sound before it makes it to the camera. Okay, you can also hit device restart, which will restart the NDI chip. Okay, so the other one, reboot, was restarting the baseboard and then the NDI chip. Device restart is just restarting the NDI chip. Okay, all right, and then the next tab, we've got two now with 112 and further on with Silicone 2. Encode settings is our main camp. This is where we're going to set up our base functions for this camera. I highly recommend that you leave it on NDI managed and that you don't set a throttle threshold for the camera. I understand why people might want to, but if you're playing with NDI and you're finding that your network is the bottleneck, we need to talk about upgrading the network, because these cameras work best when they don't have thresholds or restrictions put on them. And so if you're having issues with, I only have 80 megs per camera, we really should talk about getting a switch that is supported for NDI that would be able to handle this level of network demand. Remember, this is 110, 140 megabits per second, every second. And so you need to have the horsepower to be able to handle that. So I recommend leaving it on NDI managed, but if you do switch it to manual, you can manipulate the bandwidth here, and this is a threshold, a cap, okay? It's not I want my signal to always be 140 megs, or I want it always to be 200 megs. It is, I will use up to that amount. Okay, that's the way you think about it. The screen name, remember when we were in Studio Monitor here and we said P200? Well, look, now it says cam, right? Well, we can change that name if we want to, and we can say like, like main or something like that. Let's say like main, and we hit apply to that. This will send that information to the MDNS, which will take a few cycles to update and then retransmit. We may even close Studio Monitor and reopen it to reacquire all those signals. But then eventually that cam, this cam name will change to main. And so you can name your individual cameras. Now, I did a small experiment with this where I had 2 or 3 of the same camera in the office, and I named them all the same local name, but then I gave them all individual stream names, cam 1, cam 2, cam 3. That consolidated everything into one list, as all P200s were cam 1, cam 2, cam 3, but I found that it wasn't super practical. But you can change the stream name here, so that the other reason for this is when you're inside of vMix or Wirecast or TriCaster and you're bringing that stream in, that is what the name will display inside of vMix. So super helpful to have that so that we know what camera stream this is. The video format, this is why we didn't change the dial switch, is because we can change it here on the web UI. And so right now I'm running it 1080p 5994, and that's working quite well for me. And the NDI audio is being encoded on the NDI stream. But if you want to save a little bandwidth, click mute. And by little, I mean kilobits. I don't mean megabits. So you can hit mute, and that will lower the bandwidth usage if you want. And I don't use audio with this camera ever, and so I don't need it. And then stream to network. If I want to turn off the actual stream, I can click this button and it will put up the BirdDog screensaver in place of the camera stream. And so in vMix now I see BirdDog, the BirdDog screensaver, the nice little logo. And if I turn it back on, I reappear inside vMix. Now, I changed that screensaver here. And so if I want the screensaver to be something that I can capture with the camera, I can use the capture frame. And then I click on capture when the camera is doing the thing that I want it to do. And so I can even, well, anyways, I can even do this as a joke and put this camera here. Let's capture a frame and see if this works. Okay, so now if I go and I say off, it 100% shows that captured frame. And this is super flattering. But there I am. And that is frozen. And then if I turn on the stream, it goes back to capturing the video. So you can set a capture stream as you like. And if you turn off the stream, it goes back to that screensaver that you captured and you can really play some fun pranks on people. But you can change it to the BirdDog screen, which is what this is. And that is preferable. Or you can change it to just a black screen. The problem with this is you don't know if there's a problem with the camera or not. So it's best to leave it on something that is noticeable. Now, on some of our converter lines, we do have the ability to set a image, and that request has been submitted as a feature for cameras in the future. I have no idea when that will come, but that request has been made. So look forward to that update whenever that happens. Okay, so screensaver is just left on BirdDog right now. The onboard tally is on off right here. This is where I was manipulating it earlier in the show. So I turned that on. Onboard tally is now on, and I have a red light on the camera, and that is because I have this open in Studio Monitor, and so it's showing me that image currently. I'm going to turn this back on. And then Genlock source. Now, what is the Genlock source? Well, this is Genlock NDI 5. This is not Genlock like you're used to. NDI Genlock is basically using the timing from another NDI device on the network, okay? Whether that means that they'll be all locked in and working at the same time, that's not really how it works, but you can reference all your cameras to use the same timing off of one single source, and you would search for the list, okay? You'd refresh that list a few times, and then pull up that source on this list and select it, okay? The other thing is with the failover source, if this camera for some reason has an encode error and fails to encode, you can point the failover source at another source to reflect it. This is actually a holdover from an error that we used to have ages ago, but now it's been fixed. And if you select the source and this camera malfunctions in some way, but the NDI chip is still working, it will show the other source that you put in this list. And so it creates a little bit of redundancy. It might be a fallback image or something like that, right? So that if the camera fails while it's being used, it switches to a wide shot or something like that. So that's where you would set that failover source. And then you update that source list here by clicking refresh. You can also reset that list if the list has captured lots of cameras that are no longer connected to the network. If you hit reset, it'll flush that list clean. And of course, after any change, be sure that you hit apply. All right. Next, I'm sorry, we need to go to Silicone 2. So on that AV setup screen, there's another tab here called Advanced. And what this is the ability to output a secondary encode stream. So it gives you some options. It gives you SRT, NDI-HX, RTSP, RTMP, and disabled. And so currently it's disabled. But I could select NDI-HX, which is another NDI protocol. It's a little bit slower, but it uses a lot less bandwidth. So I can select NDI-HX. This would be HX2 or 3. And I can tell it what sort of level of what sort of GOP level I want, what sort of value that I want associated. So the more bandwidth I give it, the less latency it's going to have and the nicer the image is going to look. So if I'm using this as a secondary source, so I can set it to multi-viewers or whatever, we can enable that on Silicon 2 and then use it as a backup source or a secondary source out of the same camera, out of the same single cable connection. So so far we're up to 2 streams coming out of there, and technically 3. But as you change this, it will change, obviously, the GOP size, the bitrate size. You can customize it so you can make it whatever you want. You do need to select variable for that to actually happen. So when we go to low, when we go to medium, we want to actually make those changes in real time. So, and then there's also a custom option. So if you want to finesse it a little bit and figure out exactly what that needs to be, I'm just going to refresh this page. You want to finesse it a bit and find out exactly where that sweet spot is for you. You can definitely set a custom set the mode to custom and then change the GOP size and the bit rate to whatever works for you. So that's where you do that here on the Silicon 2 update. All right. Now I've refreshed the web UI and we're having a little issue here. So, okay. So the next piece that we're going to kind of walk through is going to be let me open this on another monitor. The next little piece is the actual AV settings. And the AV settings are going to be, I'm going to open this camera. Just give this a healthy restart. We're going to open the AV settings. And in here, we're going to talk about things like white balance. We're going to talk about things like exposure. But there's also going to be some other options under like the picture settings and the matrix settings that get to be a little bit confusing. And so I want to spend a few minutes kind of reviewing what that is, because this is where you can really go wrong with colorizing the actual image itself. Okay, so let me start by saying this when it comes to coloration. This is completely subjective, up to you. We regularly get people who are complaining and say, this camera doesn't look very good. What does that mean? Okay, it doesn't. It looks busy. It looks too dark. It doesn't look like it's working right. What do you mean by this camera doesn't look very good? Because that idea is very subjective and is up to you what it looks like, what it needs to look like. And so I've had people say, can you remote in and make this look good? It's like, well, I don't know what good looks like. I've had people tell me, I don't like the way that your set looks. I don't like the way that the blacks look on that camera. I don't like your framing. Sure, I have people do that. Not all the time, but sometimes. It's totally up to you. You get to decide what looks good, and you get to make that final call. So in this AV cam control setup area, we want to talk about what each of these buttons do so that you can get the result that you're looking for. And so that's what we're kind of going for here when we talk about this. The first tab is the basic movement function of the actual camera itself. And so here we can actually move the camera around. Let me dump this. Let me just give you a look again at the actual camera. And in the web UI, I'll change this so you can see what I'm seeing. Inside the actual web UI, you notice in Studio Monitor there are like these arrows, right? Well, we can steer the actual camera. This is a P4K that I'm using. You can steer the camera in the Studio Monitor right there on screen. But if you log into the web UI and you need more basic function like that, and you want to steer the camera, you can do that here with these arrows. And so it's the same idea as Studio Monitor, but I'm just clicking on these arrows left and right, and it's turning the camera. But I also have up and down, so that you can click on those. And we even have these diagonal shots that you can use. So if you need to turn at the same time and tilt and everything, yeah, you can make that work. So you can control the camera right here on the actual web UI itself, and that tends to be very convenient. Now, let's go back to this shot. Now, when we're using the P200, oh, that's an interesting problem to have. When we're using the P200, we can also then change things here, like we can turn off the menu that's on the baseboard. It will be very unlikely that you are going to need to use that. And let me explain why. We have worked really closely with our manufacturer to get all of the options that are on the baseboard to work with the web UI that we've designed, with the Bird UI software. And so when you go to the web UI, there should be no need to manipulate or change anything on the baseboard level unless you're instructed by support or engineering to do that. And so just know that kind of going forward, that you don't need to access that menu unless you're instructed to, because all the options to change the coloration on the actual camera are available here on the web UI. Okay, so you can turn on and off that menu right there, menu on off, and you just click it once to turn it on and click it once to turn it off. There is also a zoom option, a manual zoom, so tele or wide. If you want to zoom in or zoom out, you could manipulate those buttons directly here on the web UI. Focus mode, if you just want to run an autopilot, you selected auto. Many of us set up these in a studio, and we're not really using them for a lot of movement, so we can use manual focus in this instance. If you're doing stuff though in a live setting on a stage and you're using the actual pan tilt zoom, you're probably going to want to leave that in auto so that it leaves the focus judgment up to the camera, unless you have somebody that's actually focusing each of your cameras as you move around. And then to do that manually, so if we change this to manual, this is the in and out for that focus function. So when it's in manual, you can go in and out with the focus, but I like to leave mine in auto. That's just easy peasy with the P200. Speed control, we've given two different options for speed control. The first is standard, and it's basically what it's always been. And so the dials go up to 21 for the pan and 18 for the tilt, and the zoom speed goes up to 7. I don't know why. But if you change them to superfine, you blow my mind, then they go up to 255 and 255. And so that is a much more scalable option where it's very specific about what speed you're running at, and so you can go all the way from 0 all the way down to 255. So the extreme all on full speed is 255, but in standard mode it's 21 and 18. Okay, so you would do that there. Now if you've made a whole bunch of changes to the image and you really don't like it, or you're instructed by support or engineering to hit the image reset button, that is this button right there at the bottom of the screen. And so you would hit the reset button, and this is going to change all of your coloration options on this camera. So it'll change them all back to factory. So if you use it with caution, okay? All right, the next tab is 3D. This is a beta function that these cameras have had for actually quite a while now. But if you're integrating this with 3D software, Unreal Engine, this is where you would do that and enable that here on the screen. This is where we can manually set presets. Now, you can do this in Studio Monitor as well, but there are two different options on this that you need to know because there's a setting in here that will affect all of your presets going forward. The first is PTZ only. This records on the preset the pan, tilt, and zoom positions of the camera. That's it. If you change it to camera, it records the pan, tilt, zoom positions of the camera and the coloration options. Notice that I did not say the focus. Okay, the manual focus is not saved on the actual pan tilt zoom, and so be careful when doing that because that is something that isn't necessarily programmed. Now, it may be in the latest update. I will need to test that. The other thing that you got to be careful about here is that it does not save the speed in which the preset is executed. Okay, and so when I hit camera and hit save to, and then I hit recall to, it's going to recall it at the speed that the camera is base function sitting at. So these settings right here, okay? It's going to recall it at that speed. If I change it to PTZ only, watch what happens here. Now we get a preset slider. And what happens there is when I hit save to, it will, when I recall preset to, it will check what that number is. But it doesn't save that number on the preset. What it's doing, if I now call the preset and I set it to 15, it will recall the preset at speed 15. Okay, but only the PTZ because I'm on PTZ only. So know that if you're recording presets, it's not saving the speeds as well, because what guys want to do is something called cruise control, where they program the speeds and then they set waypoints with their presets and then they go through the presets in certain speeds. That is not a function here. That is a function on a program that we have called Camera Director. So more on that later. Okay, the next tab is exposure. And with exposure, we have a bunch of autopilot and semi-auto options, and then we have a manual option. Now, in a studio situation, we're probably going to want to do manual because I'm going to want to set this all up correctly for my clothes and for my complexion. I'm also going to want to probably put something behind me, color or something, and I'm going to want to be able to manipulate each of the elements for the camera. Now, if you're not used to camera stuff and you just want to go full auto, go for it. You will get the best estimation that the camera computer can think it can do, okay? But if you want better performance or more flexibility, you're going to want to operate in a semi-auto or an or a full manual option. And so here we go. Those two semi-autos are shutter priority and iris priority. Now, shutter priority is going to mean that it is going to allow you to pin the shutter speed at something specific, and then the camera will try and balance the image with the iris, okay? And gain, by the way, artificial gain. So if it's too dark, it's going to introduce artificial gain. Flip it now with the iris. Now we're going to pin the iris in a spot, and the shutter is going to change, and the gain is going to be introduced if needed. So those are the two like semi-automatic options. The other side here is full auto, which gives you no control other than over the gain of the image. Okay, so you can set a limit or a threshold for the gain. The camera's going to try and do its best bet. But if you're one step beyond that, we're going to go into the manual settings of the camera. And here is a great thing because we can set the gain limit, we can set the shutter speed and the iris to whatever it is that we want. And generally my lighting doesn't change. My clothing rarely, changes. I do change my clothes, but it rarely changes in terms of what the color is. And so I can get a very consistent shot time after time by setting it to manual. First thing I'm going to do is set the gain limit to as low as I possibly can. Okay, in this instance, it's 10.7. That is a threshold for gain. I'm also going to change the gain itself to 0. And what that will do is make the image probably really dark. Okay? After that, I'm going to manipulate my shutter speed to at least what it is that I am running at. So I'm running at 1080p 60, but I'm producing the show at 1080p 30. So I can change the shutter speed to 60, and that's 1 over 60, okay? 60 frames per second, or it's one frame, it's 60 frames every second. And I can even go to this camera now. All right. And then I want to open up my iris as much as I can. So I'm going to dial this way back all the way to 1.6. Now, she's facing out the window and not at me. So let's, and that preset speed is very slow. Cam control. Pan speed. Oh, am I zoomed in? Is that the problem? Oh, I'm zoomed in. Whoops, okay. Hey, there we go. Okay. Okay, so here I'm going to want to open the iris up as wide as it possibly can go. And I know this shot is terrible. But I'm going to open it up as wide as she'll go so that I can... Whoops, did I just lose her? So that I can get as much light as possible into the actual lens itself. And so I want to take my P200 and I'm going to open up that iris as wide as she'll go. And that, I believe, is set to 1.6. Now, there's a general rule when it comes to... Oops, I'll put my other camera up here. There's a general rule when it comes to colorization and exposure, okay? Light is king. We had talked about this before. Light is super important. You need more than you think you do because you can always dial it back, but you can't introduce, artificial light or you're going to compromise the image. And so light is king. It's really important that your subject is lit correctly. But I don't like to operate in the extremes all the way to one side or all the way to the other. Okay, you want to find something where you have room on both sides to go. So be really careful when you're setting the coloration to a camera, what it is that you're setting the camera to. Because if you go too far to an extreme and then you need more, you're going to be kind of locked out and you'll have to redo the entire entire image. And so you have to figure out a different way to go. Now, if your iris is all the way open, but you're running at 1 over 60 and the image is too dark, you likely have an issue where your camera needs more light. That's generally what that means. If you are running at any extreme and your image is still too dark, you need more light, hands down. And so that's a good indicator that, hey, I need to replace some lights, or I need to get this thing working or thinking correctly. I'm going to back this all the way out. Okay. And then it gives you a good general idea if you need. Now, notice the difference between the 110 and the 200. I mean, this is just general settings here, and I'll show you what I do. But it's higher contrast on my shirt, but that is actually kind of the black that my shirt is. Okay, whereas the 110 looks a little bit has a little lighter black tone to it. So if we go here to cam control, exposure, and we open the iris up all the way, okay, that's okay, but it's too extreme. It froze up on me again here. I want to change the shutter speed to 1/60 because that's what I'm planning on using this camera for, is I want to use it in a 1080p 5994 environment. And so I'm going to change the actual shutter speed to 1/60 and then start manipulating the iris from there. If I'm on either extreme with the iris, I need to dial it back a little bit or introduce more light. So I need to bring the iris back and turn up my lights, or I need to consider, do I need 60 frames? Okay, so the option there is, if it's not bright enough, you can go to 1/30, but you're going to need to change your resolution, your actual output, to 1080p 30. And 30 frames will require less light than 60. So that's an easy way to kind of figure that out if you are so inclined. So we go to cam control, and we don't want to manipulate the iris to any extreme, and so we're going to leave it somewhere at like 2.4 or something like that. And I know that my lights are bright enough for this camera, and so I don't necessarily need to change much here. And I've just got I've got a key light and a fill light, and that's working just fine. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to run like 2.8 or something like that, and I'm going to run 1/60 if I can. Now, not 1/100, but 1/60. So if I change that 1/60, see that change happen in real time, and then I can open the iris up to like 2.4 or something like that. And I'm not going to turn it because I'm having an issue here with the camera. The other options here are high sensitivity. This will give you it'll try and enhance the image itself, but it's not necessarily required. And so this is the general practice. You really want to operate in a world where you don't have to turn up the gain. Okay, you don't want the gain to have to be increased in order for the camera to work correctly, because the gain is an artificial gain. It's an artificial light. You want to be careful not to do that. White balance is the same routine though, and here I usually work in a manual mode. So as you can see, user is another word for manual, and this is where I color balance the image. Now, the way you think about color balancing, especially in a broadcast camera, is when you manipulate things on one slider, things on the other are directly affected. And so if I turn up the reds, then the greens and the blues are going to change. If I turn up the yellows, if I go back towards the yellow, or decrease the reds, we'll say, again, greens and blues are going to noticeably change. So we want to find a place that's relatively close to each other, and vice versa, by the way. So if you change the greens, you're going to see a lot of red. Okay? If you change the blues, you're going to see a whole lot less red, usually. So you want to get these into a place where they look natural, where you don't necessarily, the skin tones in particular. And that is 101 when it comes to working with cameras, is that we want to be sure that that our skin tones are correct, and that things don't look completely blown out. So I'm going to try and manipulate this one more time so you can see my face. There we go. So notice in this shot that my skin tones look pretty accurate. I mean, many of you have never actually ever met me, so you're going off of my judgment. But my skin tones are pretty accurate. They may be a little bit red, but I've moved this camera out of its housing where it was before, and so the image looks a little bit different. But you want to finesse these a little bit, and then this is manual. Then it stays here. Now, if you change any of these to a other semi-automatic or automatic white balance setting, the camera's going to do its best to figure out what white looks like. But you're far better off learning and playing with it a little bit just to know exactly what true white looks like. And so automatic's fine if you're indoors. If you're outdoors and you have indoor-outdoor lighting, Kelvin ratings, you can change it appropriately there. There is a full-on user setting, and there's an automatic setting, like another white balance setting as well. So the one push option is the camera taking a snapshot of your current situation. You click on one push, and it balances to that frame, and then it doesn't readjust after that. So if you're going to have multiple people coming and going and you don't want the white balance to change, then you could use the one push as well. Again, it's a semi-automatic option, but it gets the job done in many situations. Picture 1 is where we're going to change and manipulate things like sharpness. We're going to change things like flip and mirror. I can show you these in kind of live working order. Sharpness, I find the P200 is a little too sharp at just straight up 0. So if I change this to 0, it's a little bit too harsh on the lines. So I'd like to soften that slightly by doing something in the single digits, or maybe like -10. That seems to work really well. It softens the image just a shade so that I get accurate focus and that it looks nice online. There is a black and white effect if for some reason, I don't even know what a use case is for that feature. But anyways, there's a black and white function. Noise reduction is something that compromises the image. 0 is the fastest it will run. However, it'll look probably a little busy, okay? At the extreme, I think it's 5. At the extreme, at 5, the image will be a little blurred. So movement will look a little blurred because it's trying to reduce the noise in the shot. So I find 2 and 3 to be a really good place to start. And if you need to go to 4, go to 4. But try to avoid the extremes. Try not to go all the way up to 5 if you can avoid it, and all the way down to 0. But 3 or 2 seem to be a good place to go. There's also a flip option, so you can turn the actual thing. If you mount this on the ceiling, that's where you would change that here. Be sure that you save your presets after you mount the camera. Okay, mount the camera, flip the image, then save your presets. Okay, you can also reverse or mirror the world if you'd like. So if you want everybody to be confused about your the way that you're looking at things, you can reverse. So right now I'm looking at what it looks like in vMix. I'm looking at the web UI, and then if I turn that off, then I have to look at this screen to look at the web UI. So there you go. That's how you mirror it. And then contrast is, again, one of these subjective sliders. What looks good to you? Do you want the contrast to be... Do you want your image to be heavy contrast, really dark blacks like my shirt? Super dark right now. But if you roll this back, down to 0, it will definitely make this look more like a log style flat image, okay? And similar to the P100, not completely, but similar. Me personally, I like a high contrast shot, and so I like my black shirt to not show my white dandruff. So I turn up the contrast a little bit, and that fixes that issue. Okay, picture 2 have some more less used, less popular features, but they're still in here, and so we make them available. IR cut. If you want to see in the dark, there is an IR filter on this camera, and if you flood the room with IR light, you'll be able to see everything in the dark. So there you go. Check out IR lights on Amazon. That's a pretty cool concept. Chroma suppress is an option if that's for some reason you need that, and highlight compensation if you have a really bright subject, and in particular, if there's like a really bright light on stage, you can try and compensate for that a little bit if it's just way too much. Also backlight. So this is like if you have LCD monitors or TVs behind the subject, and you need to bring the subject into the, away from that, high lumens type of problem. You can try and do that here. I really recommend that you figure out what else to do with those LCD screens than putting them directly behind your keynote. But I get it. It's not, it's for looks and whatever. Stabilizer. If you were to mount this on a wall that had a door with like a panic bar that shakes every time it closes, and the closers are really weak, then that door shuts and the whole wall shakes. And if your camera is mounted to that wall, guess what? So stabilizer, what this does is it introduces another frame of latency and it crops the image. And then what it does is it tries to balance that image inside that cropped area. So if there's a shake, the camera tries to keep that image as stable as possible. It's a nice free feature that's included on the camera. But if you have a really shaky wall, there's nothing that's going to help that. You're going to have to buy a real stabilizer from a distributor that can help float that camera so that it eliminates those shockwaves that are happening at random. And then gamma. If your shot requires gamma, then you can change that here depending on the look that you're kind of going for. But we only have basically 0 and 1. So you can turn it off or you can turn it on. That's pretty much how that works. Okay, color matrix. This is one of those pieces that you colorists out there will really enjoy, but we can manipulate individual hues and gains of colors in the shot with a P200. And this is across most of our cameras in the fleet. But if you need to, increase the green gain, or you want to turn down the blue hues or what have you, you can do that here in kind of the color matrix, and it gives you far more flexibility when it is like maybe your subject has really red skin, or just the way the lighting is, or you're using RGB lights, for example, using RGBs where you should be using white light and it's causing like the cameras to look red. We can reduce those red hues and gains here. You do it sparingly, as little as you need, but that is actually a possibility here in the camera. And so I have used this, for example, in a situation where I had a minister who walked on stage. Lights were not great. They're very old. And he decided to wear a pink button-down shirt that day. And so his face, just his white skin complexion just went out the window. So there you go. You can change the color matrix options there. And also there's a general color gain and hue down the bottom. Okay, the Advanced tab is also more of these features that are not as widely used, but they are options. We can actually change some brightness options here, but we have to actually turn on the video enhancements for that. And then you can say, like, okay, if we want to compensate for brightness, we can select that there and tell it what compensation level to use. The gamma offset is actually one thing that I do use on this screen, and it goes all the way up to like 64. But I actually like to pull it down because this gives me more of a contrasty look in the shot. And so, I'm sorry, so here it is here. This is that screen. That gamma offset it gives you the option to make the shot a little bit more blown out, but you also can control the contrast a bit. So I actually turn this down a bit to give my P200 that darker look. And so that's where I manipulate that there if you're looking for a similar shot that I have. All right, and finally, scopes. This has been available on our camera since I think NDI 4, but scopes are super expensive. Like the devices that do this natively, and that's what they do, are like stupidly expensive. So why not just add it as a free feature? So that's what we did. And on the program and on the preview, you can turn them on. Now, excuse me. When Studio Monitor is functioning at less than half screen, it's giving you a preview image. When you change that to more than half the screen, it's giving you a program image. So if I turn off program histogram here, oh, I'm sorry, I'm actually running in low bandwidth mode. So all that is false at the moment. Low bandwidth. Now we're at high bandwidth. Okay, so this is no longer a preview image, although the camera is unfortunately right where my microphone stand is. Okay, so this is full NDI. If I turn on program preview, look, that histogram actually shows up. We give you histogram, I can look at this camera, histogram, waveform, RGB parade, and vector scopes. Many of you are going to camp out probably in the vector scope world or maybe in the waveform world. Okay, so these are showing your blacks and whites on a scale, which is super helpful, and they operate in real time. So as I move around this camera, you can see that happening directly there on the waveform. So I like that. I like vector scopes being an option. I also like that I can make this larger. Now, pro tip, this isn't actually making it larger. It is making it bigger. You say, John, what's the difference? Well, the difference is we're stretching it. Okay, that's why we're making it bigger. So it looks a little bit pixelated here, but it's still all the useful data that you can see live right here. Now, if I make this smaller, okay, and I make this tiny, Studio Monitor usually switches over to a preview window, which in this case it's not. Okay, so this might be a new feature. Switches to a preview window, and sometimes you're then looking at the preview stream. But in this instance, we're looking at the program, but let's say we just want to look at the vector scopes when we're looking at it in preview and not the full NDI stream. How do we do that? Well, did I close that? Well, what we can do is we can open Studio Monitor, can connect to the P200 and say main. Oh, look, now it says main. And say main. And then you can select, oh, I see it may have dumped on me. You can select the actual proxy, the low bandwidth that we had before. I'll go here. Can select the low bandwidth that we had before, and that will show the preview, and then we can turn vector scopes on all of our preview things. So if I go back to the web UI here, make this full screen, and I say preview enable, and I say on, that will show vector scopes only on the preview output. Okay, But when it's the full NDI connection, like in vMix, it won't show the vector scopes. Now I can turn those on again here to program enable, and it will show those on the actual program full NDI 140 meg stream if I wanted that as well, if I'm just setting them up. But it's really convenient for BirdDog cameras to have vector scopes and waveforms and all that good stuff right there on camera, right for you to use. And so scopes gives us that option. The other thing is that you can change the size, which I already did once up there in the top right hand corner, from a small to a large, and you can change the position. So we can do top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. There's even a transparency mode, but I'm not entirely sure why you would use that, so I don't know. But hey, if you use that, let me know in the comments below. Okay, and then finally, there's a logout button on that web UI. And so if you click on that, it's going to lock the BirdDog and probably take you back to the login screen. But you can still access the dashboard and all of that useful information from the dashboard without logging in. So know your IP addresses, know your short names, and that will enable you to check out all of the information for those P200s. All right, I hope that's been helpful. I hope that that's given you a good idea as to all the features that are on the faithful 200 that we've had for quite a while. It's a great camera. Hopefully, that if you have one, now you know every button and what everything does. And if you're looking to buy some, really great that that now you have this resource to know what everything is and what options you're going to get. So thanks for coming along, and we'll see you guys in the next training tutorial video.